Hello students, welcome to part 2 of your Securing the Republic lecture. This section starts with the presidency of John Adams. Now, for just about anyone, succeeding the most popular man in all of America was going to be a daunting task. It is one of God's unfortunate jokes that the person to do it was John Adams. He was argumentative and irritable. He was a strange combination of vain and insecure, constantly haunted by the feeling that he would never be properly appreciated for his role in the American Revolution. This weird amalgamation is probably because he was a good Puritan, meaning he hated everyone, including himself. Also, he was ridiculously independent-minded, and although he was a Federalist, he probably fought with his own party as much as he did with the Republicans. Now, during his presidency, Adams had a miserable time in office for all 4 years. It was probably the least successful, most unhappy time of his life. Part of this was based on the worldwide circumstances that were out of his control, but it was also his own fault because of Federalist Party dissension. Adams knew that Hamilton had tampered with the election, so he was not happy with him. However, he still had kept several of Hamilton's Federalist friends and supporters in his cabinet, so they were not loyal to Adams. Adams inherited a horrible diplomatic situation, especially in regards to problems with France. After Jay's Treaty, the French had broken diplomatic relations with the United States, which is the first step toward going to war. Immediately after that, they started the same violations of U.S. neutrality that the British had been doing. So, the French reasoned that American cargo headed for British ports was subject to the same interpretation, and so they loosed their privateers in the British West Indies with an even more devastating effect than the British had. By the time Adams was inaugurated as president in 1797, the French had plundered some 300 American ships. It looked as though the United States might actually go to war with France. Several Federalists, including the Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, were calling for war. So Adams decided to send a 3-man commission to France to work out a deal. When this commission reached France, when they got there, they had to deal with the unscrupulous foreign minister of the French government, a man named Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. However, rather than meeting with the Americans, he sent 3 Frenchmen to meet with them instead. The Americans could not pronounce the Frenchmen's names, so they referred to them as X, Y, and Z. So this is called the XYZ affair. Now, X, Y, and Z said that they would only begin negotiations if the Americans paid a bribe of $250,000 and a $12 million loan for France. This infuriated the American diplomats, so they went home and they gave the news to John Adams. Although the president remained mute on what happened, the Republicans in Congress thought he was hiding something important from them, so they demanded to release the French proposal. After refusing for some time, probably because he knew the shitstorm that would follow, Adams finally released the report to Congress, which detailed the event. When word got out about the XYZ affair, Americans were so infuriated that even partisan Republicans, except for perhaps Thomas Jefferson, joined the cry for war against France. Although most people supported the French before this event completely flipped the national mood. So in July of 1798, Congress authorized the capture of armed French ships, suspended commerce with France, and renounced the 1778 French alliance. This began what we would call the quasi-war with France. the quasi-war with France, began in 1798 and lasted for 2 years. It's often called the Undeclared Naval War because most of the fighting took place at sea around the West Indies, and it was the first undeclared war in U.S. history. Now, at the time, the United States had absolutely no army or navy to speak of. So, in April of 1798, Congress created the Department of the Navy and added 6 frigates. Also, because there was a genuine fear throughout the United States that the French might invade the country, Congress also created a 10,000-man army. To lead the army, George Washington, at 66 years old, was called out of retirement. Alexander Hamilton wanted to be second in charge. Well, Adams didn't want Hamilton involved at all, but Washington said he wouldn't lead the army unless Hamilton was his second in command. So Adams begrudgingly agreed. Unfortunately, Washington, due to his age, was unable to do much, so Hamilton essentially controlled the army and assumed a ridiculously high degree of control of the War Department. So the Hamiltonians in his cabinet and throughout the government basically treated Hamilton like he was commander-in-chief. While the Navy fought France at sea, a ferocious political battle between Federalists and Republicans was taking place at home. Both sides saw each other as traitors to the principles of the American Revolution, and the rhetoric grew so personal and tempers grew so short that opponents commonly resorted to duels. Republicans even argued that the real purpose of the French crisis was to provide the Federalists with an excuse to put down domestic opposition. And then, unfortunately, their fears became justified. The Federalists did try to take advantage of the undeclared war to hurt the Republican Party. But they went too far for the good and safety of the country, and they passed a series of 4 laws that are collectively known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. These acts were passed by extreme Federalists in Congress. Adams signed them into law. Although Federalists said the Alien and Sedition Acts were necessary to protect the Union, they were largely passed for political reasons. The Alien Acts, which made up 3 of the 4, reflected hostility to foreigners, especially the French and Irish, who tended to lean Republican. So the Naturalization Act lengthened from 5 to 14 years the residency requirement to gain U.S. citizenship. The Alien Act empowered the president to deport dangerous aliens on pain of imprisonment. Dangerous could, of course, be defined however the president chose. The Alien Enemies Act authorized the president, in time of declared war, to expel or imprison enemy aliens at will. Finally, the Sedition Act defined as a high misdemeanor any conspiracy against legal measures of the government, including interference with federal officers and insurrection or rioting. Moreover, Section 2 of the Sedition Act forbade the writing, publishing, or speaking anything of a false, scandalous, and malicious nature against the government or any of its officers, except, not so coincidentally, the Vice President, Thomas Jefferson. Also, the act was set to expire on March 3rd of 1801, the last day John Adams would be in office. In those days, March 4th was the day when a new president was inaugurated. The Sedition Act was aimed solely at the opposing party, solely aimed at the Republicans. In fact, of the 15 indictments brought under this act, with 10 convictions, all were Republicans. By today's standards, this was blatantly unconstitutional and a violation of the First Amendment. There still is an absolute freedom of speech, we have to remember, because if there is a clear and present danger, then speech is not protected. However, today we would go to the Supreme Court to find out if this was unconstitutional. But they didn't do that then, because there was no precedence for it. And Federalists controlled all of the judgeships, so there was really no point in appealing there anyway. Now, in response to this, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison did something very reactionary and ultimately incredibly unfortunate to the future of the country by passing what's known as the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. Now, James Madison wrote the Virginia Resolutions, and Thomas Jefferson wrote the Kentucky Resolutions. They wrote them anonymously, and they submitted them to the others' state legislatures. The state legislatures submitted, passed, and printed them. In these, they argued for the compact theory of the Constitution. The compact theory was the most important states' rights argument in the history of the country, and it had several parts. The major premise, the major thing stated, was that states had signed a compact or an agreement to form the Union, or the national government. So therefore, the states gave the Union its power. Therefore, states judge when the Union oversteps its powers. Under this theory, this would allow the states, rather than the Supreme Court, to be the final interpreter of the Constitution. Finally, they said that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional and wanted Congress to repeal them. In a later set of resolutions written by Jefferson, he stated that when an act is passed in violation of the Constitution, that a nullification of those sovereignties, of all unauthorized acts done under the color of that argument, is the rightful remedy. Now, this idea was really dangerous because if the states interpreted the Constitution, there would be a different interpretation for every state. The implications of this could be dangerous. If states interpret the Constitution, if they think that the national government is acting unconstitutionally, then they should be able to use nullification of a law, meaning not following the law. And ultimately, this would lead to the idea of secession, or withdrawing from the Union. Now, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were not endorsing nullification or secession, but these ideas would be used in the future to promote nullification and secession. And you can see how the compact theory of the Constitution could lead to those ideas. In fact, years later, James Madison would disclaim the doctrine of nullification when it was used by John C. Calhoun. And ultimately, these ideas would be used by Southern states to secede from the Union, leading to the Civil War. Although Hamilton and some Federalists really wanted war with France, Adams and the Republicans did not. Luckily for the president, in 1799, the government in France changed again, this time coming under the control of First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte. Also, luckily for Adams, the U.S. and France came to the bargaining table with the same objective in mind. They both wanted to end the French alliance. So a deal was worked out with the French called the Convention of 1800. This formally terminated the Treaty of Alliance with France. This was probably Adams' finest moment. The war and peace with France was the overriding issue of his administration. And throughout it all, in defiance of his own party, he kept his head when others around him were losing theirs. In fact, he asked that his tombstone read, "Here lies John Adams, who took upon himself the responsibility of peace with France in the year 1800. Unfortunately, when he opted for peace with France, he probably doomed his own chance for re-election because it killed the wave of patriotic fever that always accompanies presidents in the United States, and it disjoined his party. Also, the news of the treaty did not arrive until after the presidential election of 1800, so it had no chance of helping him. So this all set up the country for the election of 1800. There were a lot of serious issues separating the parties at this point. The Federalists were pro-British and for a strong national government, control by the elite, support for commerce, manufacturing, and banking. The Republicans were pro-French, for a limited national government, majority rule, and for agriculture or farming. The two sides' candidates were the same as in the previous election, except Thomas Pinckney's brother, Charles Pinckney, was running for the Federalist vice president this time. So, for the Federalists, you had John Adams and Charles Pinckney against Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr for the Republicans. When the campaign got going, it was characterized by slander, mudslinging, and personal attacks on both sides. The Federalist campaign in New England said, "Will you vote for God and a religious president, or impiously declare for Jefferson and no God?" Now, this was a really close contest. Adams was strong in New England, and Jefferson was strong elsewhere. However, the reason the Federalists probably lost was because of Alexander Hamilton's electoral activities. Hamilton decided he was going to mess around with the election again. But this time, he actually put in writing that everyone should vote for Pinckney instead of Adams. Unfortunately, his scathing 54-long-page criticism of Adams got into the hands of a Republican and became public. Consequently, because the Republicans were so unified, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr both got 73 electoral votes, compared to Adams' 65 and Pinckney's 64. The Republicans were so concerned about being united that they had cast all their votes for their two candidates, so neither were officially president or vice president. There was a tie. Jefferson and Burr were tied. Well, the tie then went to the U.S. House of Representatives, where each state's delegation collectively got one vote. So one state got one vote. There were 16 states at the time, and Federalists controlled 8 of them. So they couldn't decide who wins, but they could make sure no one does. So because the Republicans supported Jefferson, they all decided to vote for Burr, meaning there was a deadlock. Congress met in December and had until March 4th to decide who was president. On the first vote, Jefferson got 8 states, but couldn't get the 9th. Burr should have said here not to vote for him, because again, he knew he was meant to be vice president. But hey, he was tied with Jefferson. He thought, this is my chance to actually be president. So he refused to step down. The House voted 34 more times, and every time it was tied, 8-8. It got close to Inauguration Day without any decision. Now today, the Speaker of the House is the third person in line after the President and Vice President. But then it was the President of the Senate who was a Federalist. So this all got pretty dangerous for the future of the country. What you doing? Huh? Come on. Come on. Come on. Well, Alexander decided to step up. Alexander Hamilton, he decided to step up for the good of the country. Delaware only had one representative who was a Federalist. Hamilton wrote to him and said, Burr was an unfit, dangerous man. And although Jefferson says a lot of crazy things, he's not as crazy as he sounds. And he really wants what's best for the country. In short, Hamilton Hamilton decided to influence the delegate from Delaware to place his vote for Jefferson over Burr, and Hamilton's influence helped convince that. And so Jefferson won on the 35th vote. Now, the significance of this election is two things. First of all, the 12th Amendment was put into the Constitution in 1804 that made a separate election of the president and vice president. Second, although the Federalists lost this election, they did not try desperately to hold on to power using military force. Instead, they stepped aside and said, "We'll see you in 4 years." So there was a peaceful transfer of power between the parties. This gave us an answer to one of the 4 questions we asked at the beginning of this lecture. Could the country survive with political parties? The answer is yes. And the reason is because neither side are extremists that want to fundamentally change the foundations of the country, which are a capitalist economy and a representative democracy. So again, despite the spouting off that Republicans were being radical, the Federalists knew better. Otherwise, Hamilton wouldn't have supported Jefferson, and they would not have relinquished control of the presidency. So, Thomas Jefferson was inaugurated in Washington, D.C. in March of 1801. He was the first president to be inaugurated in D.C., even though Adams was the first person to be president there. He called his election the Revolution of 1800. Well, was it a revolution? Did the form of government change? Did the economic system? Did the party in power eliminate the losers? His first inaugural address is key to understanding the United States from then until now. First of all, Jefferson was saying that we are all Americans, that there is a consensus, that we are all for a representative form of government and support of private property. Neither side is trying to destroy the republic or is part of political extremes. Therefore, consensus and toleration are fundamental to the United States. Now, as far as government positions, Jefferson was the first president to pursue the role of party leader, placing Republicans in policy-making positions and cultivating congressional support at dinner parties. In his cabinet, he had James Madison as his Secretary of State and Albert Gallatin, a Swiss-born Pennsylvania Republican, as his Secretary of the Treasury. However, in an effort to cultivate Federalist New England, he chose men from that region for the positions of Attorney General, Secretary of War, and Postmaster General. So Jefferson refused to call for a complete replacement of all federal appointees, which is a practice we'll talk about later, known as the spoils system. As far as policies went, Jefferson left the public credit system, the first bank of the United States, and the tariffs intact, even though he had originally opposed them. He also did not sign a new treaty with France, which he had generally supported. Under Jefferson, there was, however, a reorientation of the government toward it being more limited and efficient, or smaller and less active, therefore less expensive. Some examples of this. The Sedition Act expired on the first day he came into office, and then he reimbursed everyone that had been affected by it. He also repealed all taxes. Instead of taxing, Jefferson's government made money by the sale of Western land. He also made it an objective to eliminate the national debt rather than to regulate it like Hamilton wanted it. Because he was trying to eliminate the debt and not have taxes, he had to significantly cut down the size of the Army and Navy. In those days, small government people did realize how expensive a large standing military was. So Jefferson greatly reduced the Navy. So there wasn't really a revolution, just a reorientation of the government. That said, there was an upheaval of the political system. When Jefferson entered the White House in 1800, this marked the political triumph of Republicanism and the Republican dynasty, which celebrated more democracy and would persist for the next 24 years. All of the Republican dynasty presidents were Virginia slaveholders. This marked the emergence of a new, more democratic political system dominated by political parties, bipartisanship, and wider public participation, at least for white males. Before and immediately after independence, politics was popular but not democratic, in that most people took an interest in public affairs, but only the socially prominent families dominated political circles. However, with the gradual elimination of property qualifications for voting, the public sphere in which political issues were debated and decided expanded enormously in the early 19th century. One of the biggest problems Jefferson had to deal with when he entered office was a struggle with the federal judiciary. The Federal Judiciary Act of 1789 had created a three-tier federal court system, and because to that point the executive had been controlled by the Federalists, the judge benches were all filled with Federalist members. Now, the Republicans already did not like the courts because, for one, judges were appointed for life, so they were all there permanently. And number two, during the sedition trials, Federalist judges had used the opportunity to preach politics and diplomacy. But what John Adams and Congress did, made them even more upset. First, the Federalists passed the Judiciary Act of 1801 to ensure that they would continue to control the judicial system. This act provided that the next vacancy on the Supreme Court not be filled, meaning it reduced the Supreme Court to 5 justices and made it where Thomas Jefferson could not appoint anyone. It doubled the number of circuit courts to 6, each with 3 new judgeships. Finally, it increased the number of attorneys, clerks, and marshals in the judiciary. All of these were known as midnight judges or midnight appointees, all appointed by John Adams, and they were all Federalist. Adams also named John Marshall as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a position that would be incredibly influential and that he would hold for over 30 years. All of this meant that the Federalists completely controlled the court system, which Jefferson was furious about. Some Republicans said that the law should be changed to where every judge would be changed at every election. Now, Jefferson didn't go this far, but he did have the Judiciary Act of 1801 repealed. He eliminated all of those circuit court jobs, as well as the attorneys, clerks, and marshals. Some Federalists said this was unconstitutional because even though the Constitution says judges serve for life, assuming good behavior, the Republicans were removing them from office. The Republicans said that they weren't removing the judges from the bench, they were simply removing the bench from underneath the judges. Now, during this fight, the Supreme Court ruled on a decision that significantly added to the power of the court. This is known as Marbury v. Madison in 1803. This is the most important court case in United States history. William Marbury was a Maryland Federalist. He was appointed Justice of the Peace in Washington, D.C. by President Adams at the close of his administration. So Marbury was one of those midnight judges. Now, he was appointed too late for Adams' Secretary of State to deliver Marbury his commission. Thus, it was up to the new Secretary of State under Jefferson, James Madison. Now, James Madison refused to deliver Marbury his commission. So Marbury sued him in the Supreme Court for what was called a writ of mandamus. A writ of mandamus. This is simply a court order. A court order that would force Madison to deliver Marbury his commission. Well, John Marshall, Chief Justice, and he wanted to issue the court order. But he realized that if he did, he could potentially be embarrassed because Marshall had no power to enforce the law. So instead, Marshall wrote the court's unanimous opinion, which is incredibly important. It said, first of all, that Marbury did have the right to his commission. However, Marshall said the court did not have the power to force Madison to deliver the commission because, according to Marshall, Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789, which is what gave the Supreme Court the original jurisdiction in these types of proceedings, Marshall said that Section 13 of the Judiciary Act was unconstitutional. Well, what makes this important is this was the first time in all of Western history that a court invalidated a law by declaring it unconstitutional. This set a fundamentally important precedent. So, Marshall took away the weak power of the court to force the Secretary of the State to act in exchange for much more important power, something called judicial review. Judicial review. This is making the Supreme Court the final interpreter of the Constitution. Now, ultimately, the Supreme Court becoming the final interpreter of the Constitution may have been a loss for Thomas Jefferson, but it was ultimately a win for the country. The Supreme Court needs to interpret the Constitution rather than the states because it allows for consistency. Now, Thomas Jefferson's first term as president was really popular because his domestic policies were to lower taxes and limit the size of government. He also had one of the luckiest breaks of any president that would be really good for our country. And this is the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. So, Spain had owned Louisiana for quite some time, which was good for the United States because Spain was weak and getting weaker every day. However, just as Jefferson became president, France, led by Napoleon, took Louisiana back from Spain. Now, this was very scary for Jefferson. So he immediately sent the new U.S. minister, Robert Livingston, to Paris with the power to purchase New Orleans specifically, for $5 million. If he could not buy it, Livingston was instructed to go straight to England from Paris and try to negotiate a treaty with England. Now, remember that saying, God looks out for fools, drunks, and the United States of America? Well, when the American diplomats got to France, the French said that they didn't want to sell New Orleans. They wanted to sell the entire area of Louisiana for $15 million. Now, this was more than 800,000 square miles at approximately 2.5 cents per acre for a piece of land that would double the size of the United States. Why did the French do this? First of all, in 1803, France and England went back to war with one another. And second, Napoleon had wanted France to become a power in America, so he had sent a 40,000-man army led by his brother-in-law to the island of Haiti in the Caribbean. While there, the French army was decimated by slave revolt and by yellow fever. So Napoleon decided to cut his losses and focus on financing his wars in Europe. Now, when this treaty got back to the United States, Jefferson was faced with a difficult constitutional question. He had said he was for strict construction, but nowhere in the Constitution did it mention the purchase of territory. At first, Jefferson suggested an amendment, but his advisors argued against delay in making the purchase. I mean, what if Napoleon changed his mind? Now, the Constitution does allow the president to make treaties with Congress's approval, so the power to purchase territories could rest there. Now, this is what you call broad construction of the Constitution. And if you remember, Thomas Jefferson, before he became president, had claimed that he was a strict constructionist. But as we mentioned then, strict construction is just a fabrication used by people out of power. Now, how was the United States able to buy the Louisiana Purchase if it wasn't taxing? Well, Jefferson actually had to use United States-backed securities, thanks to Alexander Hamilton's economic policies. Now, up until this point, Jeff's policies, especially this Louisiana Purchase, were incredibly successful. So much so that many New Englanders started becoming Republicans. Loyal New England Federalists realized that all of this new land out west would greatly reduce their region and their party's importance in national politics. So under the leadership of Thomas Pickering, who had been Secretary of State under Washington and Adams, and he was a U.S. Senator, under his leadership, a group of ardent Massachusetts Federalists called themselves the Essex Junto. They came up with the idea of seceding from the Union. In order for this to succeed, they needed to link New York with New England. So they went to the top politician of the state, Vice President Aaron Burr. The plan depended on Burr winning an upcoming election as governor of New York. But, due largely to Alexander Hamilton's vigorous campaign against him, Burr failed at this. Ultimately, the Essex Junto's plan was aborted. This kind of internal division, however, was incredibly dangerous for a country as young and weak as the United States still was. Had they tried to secede, it's hard to imagine that they could have been forced to remain in the country at that time. Now, Burr decided after this that he had been insulted as a gentleman, and so Aaron Burr challenged Alexander Hamilton to a duel. This duel was set to occur in July of 1804 in Weehawken, New Jersey. Dueling had been outlawed in New York State, so they had to hop over the state line into New Jersey to get it done. Now, Hamilton personally opposed dueling. His son had actually been killed in a duel 3 years earlier. But his sense of honor compelled him to meet the challenge. Now, duels were fought 24 feet away with single-shot pistols. Hamilton was determined to délope, which was a French word for throw away, meaning when you're aiming at someone, you aim high and to the right, let's say, rather than shooting at their actual body. Unfortunately, Aaron Burr had no such scruples. He shot Hamilton. The bullet went through Hamilton's body, and the former Secretary of the Treasury bled to death at 49 years of age. He bled to death in the same way, in the same city, that his son had 3 years earlier. Now, this definitely ended any chance the Essex Junto had, but it also ended the political career of Aaron Burr. Meanwhile, in the presidential election of 1804, Thomas Jefferson and New Yorker George Clinton ran for the Republicans and were opposed by Federalists Charles Pinckney and Rufus King. However, Jefferson's first term was so impressive that the election was a total wipeout, with Jefferson overwhelmingly winning. Now, although Jefferson had a really good first term as president, his second term, between 1805 and 1809, was much less successful, for the same reasons that Washington's had been. Foreign policy, specifically problems with Britain and France once again. Britain and France were at war again, or still, depending on how you look at it, and it was an all-out war to the death. Napoleon had crushed a Russian and Austrian force, leaving the French in control of the European continent. And the English defeated a combined French and Spanish fleet, making the British the dominant power of the sea. Once again, the United States tried to remain neutral. And once again, this position was not respected by either side, via the violation of our neutral commercial rights. The United States had a valuable trade with France and the French colonies in the West Indian Islands. So, being good Americans, shippers found a way to use this, called the Broken Voyage. What this means is, United States merchants would go to the West Indies. Then they would go to an American port. Then they would go right over to France. When the British found out that U.S. shippers were doing this, they began keeping war vessels outside of most major American ports and stopping every ship that went in or out to inspect and possibly take the goods, ships, or even the sailors. While the issue of commerce was serious, even more disconcerting for Jefferson was the practice of impressment. Impressment, this was a practice by the British, which meant taking sailors off of American ships and forcing them to work in the British Navy. This practice was necessary in order to ensure their ships had enough men, since serving on the British Navy was a floating hell. Everyone who worked in the British Navy ships got whipped at one point or another. And after 36 lashes, salt water was thrown on the person's back. Also, the only way out of the British Navy was through death or disability. So British sailors would jump ship when they were near American ports, swim to shore, and then work for American shippers. Now, the British impressed thousands of Americans. This was not only a violation of our neutral rights, but a violation of our rights as a sovereign nation. And because the Navy was so fundamentally important in their battle to deal with France, the British government would not even negotiate about impressments with U.S. diplomats. In 1807, there was an incident with a ship from the U.S. Navy called the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake was ordered to stop by a British ship outside of Norfolk, Virginia. The Chesapeake had just left port, so it wasn't cleared for action. So, when the British ship started firing upon the Chesapeake, the Americans could not retaliate, and they had to surrender. 3 American crew members were killed and 18 were wounded. 4 sailors were impressed. The Chesapeake limped back into harbor, and when news spread, Americans were so upset that Jefferson could have called for war immediately. Jefferson decided that he was going to fight back instead, however, with economic pressure. So Jefferson had Congress pass the Embargo Act of 1807. This was passed to protect U.S. ships, goods, and sailors by prohibiting all exports of American goods and American ships from leaving for foreign ports. So Jefferson was gambling that the European powers needed American goods and supplies, so much so that they would make some concessions in negotiations. However, we're going to see that the Embargo Act did not work for 2 reasons. First of all, the Embargo Act hurt the U.S. economy way faster than the European countries. With American ports closed, ships idle, crews laid off and unpaid, and even southern and western farmers suffering for want of foreign outlets for their goods, the U.S. economy tanked. In contrast, the British enjoyed a near monopoly on trade throughout the Atlantic. And it also turned out that France wasn't really hurt by the embargo very much either. So once again, being good Americans, a lot of shippers just started breaking the law, which was laughably easy. Merchant shippers would load up with goods in the Carolinas, and while heading up to New England, let's say, get accidentally blown off course and happen to end up in a foreign country. Now, the Embargo Act stayed in effect until 1808 when Jefferson left office. And the Embargo Act had been Jefferson asking too much of his countrymen. He had wanted them to rot for the good of the United States rather than fighting for it, and it just did not pay off. By 1808, Jefferson was glad to uphold Washington's precedent and left office after his second term. While the Embargo Act should have really hurt the Republicans in the next election, James Madison ran for the presidency against the Federalist Charles Pinckney, and he won by a good margin. He didn't win by quite as much as Jefferson had, however. Now, under James Madison, the U.S. tried other forms of economic coercion, but the measures were all weaker than the Embargo Act, and all of them failed. The British made absolutely no concessions on neutral rights or impressments. So, in 1811, the U.S. minister to England was called home. And remember, this is the first step to war. The Madison administration simply had run out of ideas. Now, in 1811, a new force became involved in politics. A significant number of new Republican congressmen from the South and the West came to Washington with the idea that the U.S. needed to get prepared to fight Great Britain. And if they didn't, they might as well give up their independence. These people came to be known as the War Hawks. These included Henry Clay from Tennessee and John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. A couple of handsome devils, if you ask me. Now, they said it doesn't matter how we do it, but we must force the British to stop violating our commercial rights and impressments. Now, while the primary reason for war with Britain was the demand for neutral shipping rights, War Hawks were also upset about problems in the West with the Indians. Americans started moving into that Ohio Valley in the Northwest Territory in the 1790s. And by the early 1800s, Americans were moving as far west as Indiana. As they expanded westward, they continuously had problems with the Indians there, which they blamed on the British in Canada. With little hope of help from war-torn Europe, British officials in Canada had actually been steering a safe course. They had been discouraging warfare while seeking to keep the Indians' friendship and fur trade. What the natives were particularly upset about was the notorious practice by Americans of getting a few individual Indians, usually getting them drunk, and getting them to sign treaties for large tracts of land. William Henry Harrison, the governor of Indiana, was especially responsible for such acts. Things like the treaty at Fort Wayne in 1809, where he managed to get Indian chiefs to give up 5 million acres to the Americans. In opposition to this Anglo encroachment, the Shawnee chief Tecumseh tried to unite all the Indians against the American settlers. To help him, Tecumseh's brother gave the movement a spiritual element when he gave up drinking and became the prophet. Now, the prophet said that Indians had to give up Anglo ideas and embrace their native culture. Now, Tecumseh was furious over the Treaty of Fort Wayne, and he demanded to meet with Governor Harrison. It was clear that the expansion in Ohio was going to cause trouble. In the fall of 1811, Tecumseh went south to recruit other Indian tribes. While he was gone, William Henry Harrison gathered an armed force of 1,000 men and set up camp right next to the prophet's headquarters at Prophetstown, which was on the Tippecanoe River. All the younger hothead Indians wanted to fight, and the prophet encouraged it, even guaranteeing their success. At the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, 600 to 700 Shawnee Indians surprise attacked and killed about 1/4 of William Henry Harrison's men before being driven off. Although Harrison's force suffered twice as many casualties as the Indians, the governor then burned their entire abandoned village to the ground. He discredited the prophet and ascended Tecumseh's Indian Confederacy. He called the Battle of Tippecanoe a victory. Now, the significance of this is the Battle of Tippecanoe reinforced suspicions among Americans that the British were inciting the natives to attack the Americans. The Warhawks cited this as evidence for the U.S. needing to declare war against Great Britain. Under these circumstances, James Madison reluctantly asked Congress for a declaration of war on June 1st of 1812. While Congress debated the issue, the government in Britain, facing an economic crisis and not wanting to risk war with the United States on top of its war with Napoleon, actually conceded to American neutral rights on June 16th of 1812. Unfortunately, news did not travel across the Atlantic Ocean fast enough, and 2 days later, on June 3rd of 1812, Congress concurred with Madison's request and the United States declared war on Great Britain, a war that was not necessary. Now, the vote in Congress in 1812 was truly strange for a few reasons. First of all, it was the closest vote for a declaration of war in U.S. history, totally down party lines. Second, the congressmen who voted for the war were overwhelmingly from the South and the West, sections of the country that were farthest removed from ocean traffic and least involved in shipping, and thus least affected by the violations of neutral rights and the impressments that were the professed reasons for declaring war. At the same time, the congressmen most opposed to the war were from New England, and this was the area that was most hurt by British impressment of American sailors and the British violation of neutral rights. What accounts for this? Well, it is the logical conclusion of Republican diplomatic policy since 1805. They didn't want to tax or spend money, and they had cut the military down to almost nothing. Thus, when the British began impressment and the violation of neutral rights, the United States was incapable of defending itself and could only respond with weak economic coercion. The political popularity of Republican policies put America on a course of war by taking away all other options. The U.S. had to stand up for itself or face the prospect of forever being treated like a nation without sovereignty or independence from its former colonial power. Now, going into the War of 1812, the United States faced some serious obstacles, including political divisions with Federalist opposition to the war, an opposition that was so intense that the War of 1812 was probably the most unpopular war in American history. This was especially true in New England, where they had most of their power. To the Federalists, declaring war with Britain when they were at war with France was like stabbing them in the back and destroying any chance for civilization to remain. In 1812, James Madison ran for re-election. He was opposed by the Federalist DeWitt Clinton. Now, as you can see here, the Republicans led by James Madison still won, but each election they've won by a less and less margin. Now, that meant, of course, that if things continued this way, the Federalists might actually have a chance of winning here eventually. Well, in 1814, the Federalists called for a meeting known as the Hartford Convention. 3 New England states sent representatives, and some even talked about secession from the U.S. again in order to join Britain, for New England to join Britain. Now, these people were in the minority, for sure. But they adopted proposed constitutional amendments to protect the interests of New England. They sent a delegation to Washington, D.C. to show to the Congress and to the President. Now, this kind of internal division was incredibly dangerous for a country as young and as weak as the United States. Had they tried to secede once again, it's hard to imagine they could have been forced to remain in the country. Another serious dilemma the U.S. faced going into the War of 1812 was simply the unpreparedness of the country. The Republican Party loathed war and all that it entailed in tax, debt, and executive power. The problems with the limited government policies of Jefferson and Madison became grossly apparent in the country's lack of preparedness, both financially and militarily. Although the Republican programs of a small federal budget and military cutbacks were politically popular, they rendered the U.S. incapable of effectively dealing with the impending crisis that had loomed for nearly a decade. In 1811, despite earnest pleas from Secretary Treasury Gallatin, Congress had let the 20-year charter of the Bank of the United States expire. Consequently, many state banks were being mismanaged, resulting in deposits lost through bankruptcy. Trade had dried up. Loans were not needed to cover about 2/3 of the war cost, and Northeastern opponents of the war were reluctant to lend money. Loans were needed to cover about 2/3 of the war cost. By 1814, the government defaulted on its national debt, the public credit was defunct, and the United States was bankrupt. The country's budget was in a mess. So that's pretty bad. On top of that, the military situation was almost as bleak. War had been likely for nearly a decade, yet Republican defense cutbacks had prevented preparations. The War of 1812 began. The Army numbered only 6,700 men, ill-trained, poorly equipped, led by aging officers, most of whom were veterans of the Revolution. The Navy comprised only 16 vessels. This is in contrast to the British, who had around 250,000 vessels and the most powerful navy in the world, with 1,000 warships. Even Congress finally authorized increasing the regular army by 25,000. Only 9,823 men could be recruited. Hardly surprising, since the recruiting officers could not even offer a decent uniform and a pair of shoes. As a consequence of all this, generally speaking, the War of 1812 was a disaster with more military failures than successes. We're actually going to skip this slide. Now, overall, when it comes to the War of 1812, we're not really going to spend any time talking about the particular battles. Overall, the U.S. had some successes, but it was mostly a disaster for the United States. And in 1814, the English finally defeated Napoleon, which meant they were able to have all of their attention and resources turned from being split between the French and the United States to focusing solely on the United States. And the British decided that they were going to teach their former colony a lesson by launching a couple of offensives in 1814. The first was at Washington, D.C. and Fort McHenry in Maryland. Now, the British landed a force of about 4,500 men in Maryland and marched almost totally unopposed to Washington, D.C. When they got there, British officers ate a warm meal in the White House that had been prepared for President Madison by his wife Dolly. They then burned all the government buildings to the ground in the city. Then, the British force moved on and attacked Baltimore, the fourth largest city in America. They bombarded Fort McHenry. This was on an island in the harbor outside Baltimore. Now, Fort McHenry was held by about 1,000 American soldiers. Now, while this was happening, while the British were bombarding Fort McHenry, a Washington lawyer named Francis Scott Key was having a dinner on a nearby British ship, trying to negotiate for the release of American prisoners. Once aboard the ship, he wasn't allowed to leave, since he was familiar with the strength and position of the enemy's ships and units. So all he could do was watch from a distance the bombardment of American forces at Fort McHenry over the night of September 13th to the 14th. At the dawn's early light, when he looked at the fort, he could see the American flag was still there. So he wrote a poem about it. The poem was set to the tune of an old English drinking song, and it became the U.S. national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, the British soon abandoned this attack on Fort McHenry, so the offensive of Baltimore did not come to a lot. Now, another British attack is known as the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. Now, this comprised of an English unit of 8,000 men who tried to take the city of New Orleans from Major General Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was holding New Orleans for the Americans, and he had with him a ragged, motley army of about 4,000 Tennessee and Louisiana militia, some mounted Mississippi dragoons, an Irish-American regiment, 2 battalions of black soldiers. One was African-American, and one was Haitian immigrants. There were some slaves, some Choctaw Indians, and the infamous band of pirates led by Jean and Pierre Lafitte. So quite a crew. Now, New Orleans was the second most important port in the United States after New York, and it would remain so for more than 100 years when it was finally overtaken by Los Angeles. Thus, New Orleans had to be defended at all costs. So, taking no chances, Andrew Jackson imposed martial law on the city on December 16th of 1814. Now, making a really complicated story short for this purpose, by January 8th of 1815, the British needed to break through the American defenses to get to their shelter and supplies in New Orleans. Now, in doing so, the British had to lead a charge against American forces that were stationed behind a bulwark of earth and logs. This had been constructed behind an abandoned canal that served as a moat. So, the British devised a complicated 3-pronged plan of attack. One unit was to cross the Mississippi River to capture the cannons and then turn them on U.S. forces. Another unit, made up of West Indians and light infantry, was to infiltrate the swamp at the opposite end to turn the Americans on their left side. And finally, the main British force would have 2 assaults across the Chalmette Plantation against Andrew Jackson's Central Army. All of these assaults were to be led by troops carrying fascines. Now, fascines are simply bundles of sugarcane that they would fill that canal ditch with so that they could cross over it. Now, again, I realize that was all complicated, and you don't need to know all those details. I'm just trying to give you a little bit of an explanation for how this went down. Now, it's a plausible plan on paper, but coordinating the attack was a disaster. It was a really foggy day, so no one could see very far in front of themselves. As the British soldiers crossed the Chalmette Plantation and they got to the canal, they realized that the troops carrying their crossing tools weren't there. So the men were just standing there, unable to fill in the canal and cross. They were blown straight to hell by the Americans. In all, the British lost 2 generals, 8 colonels, 251 soldiers were killed, 1,259 were wounded, and 484 were missing. On the American side, 11 men were killed and 23 were wounded. This battle made Andrew Jackson a national hero. Now, before the Battle of New Orleans even took place, a settlement had been reached between the United States and Britain called the Treaty of Ghent. This actually ended the War of 1812 on what we call status quo antebellum, meaning no one won anything and no one lost anything. Now, regardless for the way it ended, the War of 1812 was significant for several reasons. First of all, the U.S. proved something just by fighting and not surrendering. The U.S. was a huge underdog, but it remained standing in the end. So it looked to the world like the U.S. had actually won. Since the United States had gained independence, the British had never treated it like a sovereign nation. However, after the War of 1812, England never treated the U.S. with the same lack of respect. That's why the War of 1812 is sometimes called the Second War for Independence. The U.S. demonstrated that it would not allow another country, no matter how big and powerful, to treat it like anything but a sovereign nation. Also, the Republican Party was transformed by the war. While in power, Madison, as Jefferson earlier had, realized that a strict construction of the Constitution was simply untenable. Before the War of 1812, Republican small government policies had reversed many of Hamilton's economic programs to the detriment of the country. The finances of the U.S. government were so bad that during the war, Congress was forced to pass heavier taxes than had ever been imposed on the population, and the national debt still more than doubled. Many Republicans, including Madison, even supported a national bank that was even larger than the one Hamilton had established. So the small government, strict interpretation Republican ideology was abandoned due to the pragmatic consequences of necessity. The War of 1812 also meant the death of the Federalist Party. This was partly because they looked like quitters at best, traitors at worst, in opposing the War of 1812. The Federalists from the Hartford Convention, when they got to Washington, D.C. with their demands, they got there immediately after news of the Treaty of Ghent and the victory at the Battle of New Orleans reached the city. So they presented their demands amid huge celebrations and a strong feeling of nationalism. But also, because the Republicans had changed their position on Federalist economic issues, the party became an unnecessary faction. Consequently, in the election of 1816, James Monroe ran and easily beat his Federalist opponent. By 1820, James Monroe, as a Republican, would run again, completely unopposed. So to summarize, let's make sure we've answered our questions here. So would the national government under the Constitution be strong enough to deal with the country's internal problems, yet not so strong that it would destroy the freedom and liberty of individuals and states? Well, there were times when some people said the U.S. government was too strong, such as with the Alien and Sedition Acts or the Embargo Act. There were other times when the country looked like it was too weak internally, such as with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, the Essex Junto, or the Hartford Convention. Overall, though, the country was able to deal with its problems by becoming financially stable, thanks to Hamilton's economic plans. It also became geographically secure, thanks to the Louisiana Purchase and Pinckney's Treaty, and militarily strong enough to defend itself internally. We can look at the Whiskey Rebellion and the Battle of Fallen Timbat. Second question. Would the government under the Constitution be strong enough to get other countries to respect it as an independent nation? Well, throughout most of this period, which remember we're at 1789 to 1815, throughout most of this period, the U.S. was totally incapable of getting either the French or the British to respect it as an independent, sovereign nation. Under George Washington, both the French and the British violated our neutral rights. We can think of Edmund Genet with the French, the British seizure of U.S. commercial vessels, the refusal of the British to let go of their forts in the Northwest Territory. Under John Adams, the French violated our neutral rights to the point that we got into a quasi-war with them. And under Jefferson and Madison, the British violated not only our neutral rights, but our rights as a sovereign nation, and this was through impressment, until finally we went to war with the British. Although the United States mostly lost during the War of 1812, as a country we held our ground. We had some victories, the Battle of New Orleans, did not surrender, and were standing in the end. Neither the French nor the British ever disrespected us again. Third question. Would the U.S. evolve as a democratic republic, or would we try to remain an aristocratic republic? Well, because the Republicans were the only party standing when all this was over, and they tended to believe that people could run their own affairs, the country was obviously moving toward more democracy. Final question. If Americans differ on how these questions ought to be answered, and these differences turn into political parties, would political parties destroy the country? There were definitely times when it seemed like political parties were going to destroy this young republic. Again, think of the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions, Essex Junto, Hartford Convention. However, both sides were able to compromise, such as with Hamilton's reports. Both sides worked together, such as in the divided cabinets of Washington and Jefferson, and with the Louisiana Purchase. And most importantly, both sides were willing to give up power. The election of 1800 is a good example of this. The reason we can survive political parties is because, although they have some real differences, our system works within a consensus. Everyone in the country wants a representative form of government with a capitalist system. As Jefferson said in his inaugural address, "We are all Federalists. We are all Republicans," meaning we are all Americans. The differences we do have, we settle peacefully at the ballot box.